So the UK had some interesting news earlier this year. They put forward a proposal, then withdrew it. Tell me what happened there.
Yeah, so I think for, let's say, lobbying for third country covered bonds in the UK, 2025 has been a tale of making the best out of what was a very bad situation for a time period. So there had been a lot of work done to try to get equal treatment for third country covered bonds in the UK rules for some time due to a quirk in how the rules were brought over from the European Union post-Brexit. UK banks found that they were having to hold a lot more capital to buy third country covered bonds than their own domestic product, and there's a desire to diversify away from UK mortgage risk since they already have a lot of that on their balance sheets. And also the sterling market is half domestic, half foreign. So we started to notice a big spread differentials between domestic product and foreign product. I obviously work for a Canadian bank, so we take notice in this when we're advising our own treasury. And we started to approach them and say, look, would it not make sense to do what the Basel rules say and treat all legislative covered bonds the same? We're getting some traction. Then we had the surprise in April where the PRA essentially called into question the LCR eligibility of non-UK covered bonds, which is not something that was on anybody's radar, and I think caught people quite a bit off guard. So great story there is that this really galvanized both investors who were looking for diversification, but also UK issuers who are thinking about equivalence in the EU and how they position for that reciprocity to lobby and get that reversed. And the latest news there is that there's potential for an equivalence regime in the UK rules that will position that jurisdiction for what the EBA is hopefully going to release soon.
But it was withdrawn within 9 days.
Yes.
Is that just the reflection of incredibly good lobbying, or
I think
what
it's a reflection of some of the touch points that had already been in place for the lobbying that I mentioned beforehand, and also just the importance of the product in the UK and the attention that it got. And I think the view that, well, if this has happened without any kind of consultation, there needs to be an improvement and an urgency to the communication with the authorities to make sure they understand how important the product is.
Yeah. And then, of course, that's just a prelude to the main act, which is the EBA, and their rule. And what are they? How do you understand what they're saying about the concept of third-party equivalence? I know it's not been published yet, but we've got some fairly heavy.
We have that to
hints.
look forward to this weekend for 230 pages of lovely reading after a long conference. But look, I think there's already been some communication and some hints as to what they'd be looking at. So clearly, the cost-benefit analysis for the EU seems to work out, and they want to introduce some sort of regime. It's not going to. The paper is not going to have a list of countries that they recommend for equivalence, but effectively is just going to look at reciprocity. So what is it meant for the EU in terms of what the investor base in those countries have to offer? How are they treating EU covered bonds? How is that going to work? And then there's going to be very specific details on what they're going to look at in terms of the principles of the covered bond directive versus that local law, the supervisory authorities, things like the definition of a credit institution. And I think it's important to remember that this EBA paper is not just about equivalence. They're looking at other things like extendable maturities. They're talking about further harmonization of cover pools and making other tweaks, for example, also around derivatives that could then complicate the equivalence discussion if those changes come into play and have to be factored into legislation of third countries as well.
Well, most of the non-EEA issuers already conform to the directive as it is now, but we don't know.
Well, for example, things like, I think for extendable maturities, they want to involve the regulator more in those discussions. The majority of third country covered bonds use a guarantor SPV model where there's no discretion, there are objective triggers, but there's no involvement of the regulator really, except in the default of the actual bank. Is that going to work if they amend it or not? It's to be seen, I think.
Are there any other things that worry you about the proposal?
I think devil's always in the detail, so we have to go through those 230 pages. I think the requirement to have a standby swap counterparty for people who have internal swaps could be complicated for some non-euro funders who have for large notionals out there. But for the most part, I think it's really a culmination of a lot of work that's been done at people that are around us to kind of not only get the directive in place, but to look at third country equivalents. So worry is probably the wrong word. I think I'm optimistic, but there's still a lot of work to do.
But of course, it's just a proposal. Have you any thoughts on how long this is going to take to take into
with all
account?
these things, I go with Luca's expertise, and it feels like this could be 4 to 5 year process, to be honest. So, as I was saying on the panel, a lot of the debt that's being issued today probably roll off before equivalence even comes into place. So, I think we're in it for the long haul.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for explaining it to me.
All right, thanks.